there, and you're listening to the Get Meal Prep Show, a podcast about meal planning strategies, improving your nutrition, and getting dinner on the table. I'm your host, Susan Watson, registered dietitian, lifestyle nutrition coach, and meal planning strategist for the online course Get Meal Prepped. I'm so happy to have you here today and share this episode with you, so welcome. Before we get started, if you find this episode beneficial, interesting, or helpful in your journey to be healthy, please let us know by leaving a review on iTunes, subscribing to YouTube, or sharing this with your family and friends. You can leave a review about our show straight from your podcast app by searching Get Meal Prepped Podcast, then click reviews and then write us a review. We would love to hear from you. Today we're talking about recipe makeovers, and I have part 1 of 7 ways to cut or reduce fat in a recipe. So let's get started. Hi everyone, and welcome to the Get Meal Prepped podcast show. I'm Susan Watson and this is Andrea Hardy. Welcome to our show today. We're really looking forward to talking to you about 7 ways to cut or reduce fat in a recipe. So at our last episode, we talked about some of the rules to recipe makeovers. So if you haven't listened to that, make sure you go back and take a listen to it, because when you're meal planning and you want to take a look at your master meal list and you've got the recipes that are tried and true, sometimes they're really great recipes, but there's some things that you can do to make them a little bit healthier. So this is going to be at least a 3 or 4 part series about different things that you can do to upgrade or swap out in your recipes to make them taste better, as well as to be healthier. So we're going to start off with talking about fat and all the things that you can do to reduce or swap out to make your recipes healthier, looking at fat. So when it comes to calories, all fat sources are fairly equal. Each gram of fat provides 9 calories. And this is more than double of what you get from protein or carbohydrates. So whether it's butter, margarine, lard, or olive oil, they all provide the same amount of calories. But not all fats are created equal in their nutritive qualities. So healthier fats are those that you can see through, such as olive oil, canola oil, sunflower oil, or vegetable oils. Less healthy fats are fat choices like coconut oil, palm oil, and the solid fats such as butter, lard, or the very, very bad for you, hydrogenated hard margarines, shortenings, fat and meat, and skin like chicken skin or ghee. So here are tips for reducing and replacing fat in a recipe. And just a quick shout out to Dietitians of Canada for some of these great tips that we're going to be providing you today. So tip number 1. Reducing or cutting out butter in oil or baking recipes like cookies, cakes, breads, or muffins. So when you can replace up to half the fat in a recipe that is called for with either mashed fruit or vegetables. So for example, unsweetened applesauce or pureed pumpkin, squash, sweet potato, these are all good replacement items in food items like cookies, carrot cakes, banana bread, and pureed prunes are also a good replacement for fat in chocolate cake. So have you ever heard of that one, Andrea?
I haven't heard of that one. I do a lot of vegetables and pulses, but I've actually never used pureed prunes, and that's a really great idea.
Yeah, a ton of fiber, right? So the other thing you can do is you can reduce the overall fat called for with no substitution by 1/4 or 1/3, and it usually won't affect the recipe at all, and the only difference is that it might become more stale quickly. So I've done some recipes before where I've cut the fat quite a bit, and it doesn't have the same moist qualities to the recipe, and so they're good, that day and maybe the day after, but they tend to go stale a little bit faster.
Sure. And I typically,
You go.
Yeah, I typically I'll cut back in the fat quite significantly. I'll use just that 1/4 of fat, and then I will top it off with those pureed vegetables or pureed lentils or what have you. And it's a great way to sub out something more nutritious, something higher in fiber, and something a bit less calorie dense for the fat. So you still get in that 1/4 or 1/3, of the fat to give it that texture, and then top it off with those veggie or fruit purees.
Oh, excellent, for sure. And the other tip here is you can replace about 3/4 of the fat in yeast breads with ricotta cheese. So
I did not know that. I love ricotta. That's a great idea.
yeah, it definitely has a quality that you can replace it with. So that's great. So tip number 2, don't use fat to grease baking sheets or muffin tins. So, really it's a waste. And I like to use parchment paper for everything. I purchase a big double 2-pack roll from Costco and I line everything with it. My reasons are actually twofold. One, I don't like to grease the pan, but 2, it makes cleanup so easy. Whenever I bake a casserole or bake chicken, I use parchment paper. And then the dish that I'm using doesn't get as dirty when, with caked on food. And it's really easy to clean because I can just put the dish in the dishwasher.
Sure.
So, yeah. Take home message, I love parchment paper and it's a kitchen cook's best friend. And yeah, I absolutely love it.
I use it a lot in my house too, parchment paper. Sometimes I'll use tin foil as well if I'm trying to like enclose steam in, but you can do that with parchment paper too.
Yep, absolutely. Some of those dishes that I've seen recipes that you can steam fish or salmon and use parchment paper. So parchment paper can be used pretty much in any situation that a recipe calls for greasing a pan. So it might take a little bit of snazzy snipping with scissors, but I actually line muffin tins with parchment paper. I just cut it into a square and push it down into the muffin tin first. I line my bread pans with parchment paper, baking sheets, you name it. So when a recipe calls for greasing a pan, think of lining that pan with parchment instead, and you'll save quite a bit of calories. The other option is to use a silicone baking sheet or a silicone baking pan. I have 2. I have a muffin liner, so it's actually a little muffin liner cups that you can put inside of a regular muffin pan, or I've got an actual, it's full out silicone with 12 spots for making muffins. So it's a muffin, I guess, tin, but it's made out of silicone. So I think they're called muffin molds.
Yeah,
and I really like using them. And I find that you have to, after you're done baking, you have to let it sit for a little bit, and almost moisture or steam builds up between the silicone and the muffin that you made, and then you can just pop them out, and you didn't need to use paper, you didn't need to use foil or anything like that.
sure.
So
I use the cookie sheet liner, silicone liners, and they're great. Quality seems to make a difference. So like the really cheapy ones don't seem to last long, and also seem to like really transfer like smells and that sort of stuff. So I found investing in a good one has really gotten good longevity out of it.
Yep, absolutely. Tip number 3, when oiling a frying pan, use a vegetable oil spritzer and give it a light spray, then use a paper towel to spread the oil around. This way it gives it a really nice thin layer of oil without any excess. So I've had a few different vegetable oil spritzers in my day, and I actually find the really expensive ones that you buy, they're the ones that crap out on me the earliest. The ones from the kitchen stores that you kind of pump air into. So I just went to the dollar store and I got a little like squirt bottle.
Mister bottle?
And not even
That's
a Mister
great.
bottle. It's just like a squirt bottle that you would put water in, or like Windex in, right? Like you would buy and fill with your own ingredients. And so I just used that, and it's doing pretty well. It doesn't clog up or have any problems, and you can change the way it sprays at the top of the nozzle. So yeah,
that's
like
great. Lots of people always ask me about Pam. Can I use Pam? And I like to use like the olive oil based one, or they also have I believe canola oil based one. It's kind of a nice way to get that light layer as well. Obviously aerosols aren't the best for our environment, but I have the same problem. So I'm going to go to the dollar store actually and pick up a spray bottle, and hopefully it will last longer than my last 2 oil spritzers.
This one's going on 2 years now, and it's totally fine. So I don't know why they haven't made an oil spritzer that actually lasts, but it's probably because you're pumping air into it, and this you're you're not having to pump any air into it. So it works really well. And I guess the reason why I don't buy Pam or let's not use a brand name,
Sure.
the aerosol oil cans. I just find that I'm too cheap. I'm thinking about how much oil is probably in those, and like you can get so much more if you just buy your oil and put it into a container, and you're not having to consume so many products and have stuff on your shelf. So
Yeah, that's great.
it's a good way to repurpose oil that you've bought. So moving on to tip number 4. So this is a good one here. So egg yolks have fat in them, and you can reduce the amount of fat in a recipe by using, say, 2 egg whites or just under a quarter cup of egg substitute for each whole egg. And because the yolk has fat in it, it's going to reduce the fat in the recipe. The other thing I like to use now is called a flax egg. And this is 1 tablespoon of ground flaxseed or ground flax meal with 2.5 teaspoons or tablespoons of water. So it's about 1 tablespoon to 2 tablespoons water. And then you add the flax seeds to the water and you stir it around. And this becomes kind of like a gooey, messy gelatin muck.
Yes.
But you can replace an egg in a lot of recipes like cookies and baking with the flax egg, and it works really well. Flax eggs work well in muffins, pancakes, breads, cookies, and it doesn't work so well in recipes that require stiffening or binding. So,
Right.
Anything that you might need to whip up.
Right.
But the other thing I've been experimenting with is called aquafaba. Now, this is definitely a higher level recipe makeover ingredient to play around with, but Andrea, have you heard of aquafaba?
I've heard of it. I've eaten it in a baked good. I think somebody made like an aquafaba meringue at a food event I went to, but I actually haven't made it yet myself.
Oh, I had to. The minute I heard about it and saw it, I was like, I gotta try this because it was just too much for me not to actually try it.
For
So,
sure. And it's great. A lot of my food allergy intolerance patients may not be able to have eggs, so having these egg substitutes is so key.
yeah, so let's talk about what aquafaba is and how you can use it as a egg replacer. So aquafaba is the liquid leftover from cooked canned chickpeas. So it can be added to recipes and um, using it unwhipped as an egg binder. It can be whipped into a semi-stiff peak and be used anything that needs egg white as a substitute. And then it can also be whipped into stiff peaks and made into things like meringues and macaroons. And this liquid seems to be the perfect egg replacer. And it's one of the least expensive and most accessible egg replacers that I know of. So think about you buy a can of chickpeas and then you drain all that liquid. That is what aquafaba is. And you can put it into a blender and you can whip it up. You can replace it in recipes and it will work just like eggs. I didn't believe it, to be honest, when I heard it. I was like, no way. So I seriously went and I drained some and tried it out. And it actually does work. It's crazy. There's lots of videos online. You can just Google aquafaba and watch a YouTube video on how it's done. But it does work. And I'm actually, one of my nutrition student volunteers is working on an article for me that will be posted soon, all about aquafaba. And my question to her was like, can you make it without buying canned chickpeas? And yes, you can. So you just have to condense the liquid a little bit. So if you're worried about salt from the can, because we usually tell people drain that liquid and rinse your chickpeas. And so it might have a little bit of salt. You can buy no salt added chickpeas to get the no salt aquafaba as well. So anyways, that's a really interesting thing. I would say it's a high level recipe replacer, but it is possible. Anybody who has a egg allergy, this is a great substitute, or anybody who is trying to veganize a recipe, it's also a great substitute. Tip number 5. Instead of using full-fat cream in soups, try thickening soups with pureed cauliflower, potatoes, carrots, lentils, or tofu, or you can just use a lower-fat milk like 1% or 2% instead of cream. So, Andrea, have you ever done that before?
Yeah, I'm pulse crazy. So always pureed lentils are in abundance at my house. And actually, I've started using tofu as a fat replacement as well. So that silken plain tofu, I use as a fat replacement in baking. And I've tried it in a couple of kind of curry-based soups.
Yeah.
And it's delicious, high in protein,
Yeah.
high in those, flavonoids that are really good for health. So it's a great sub for that full fat milk, and it's very creamy.
Yep, absolutely. So that's great. When I was doing this, I used to always just, instead of putting cream in, just puree out potatoes, but, still just trying to keep the recipe as healthy as possible. I have been experimenting with cauliflower, and it keeps everything looking creamy, and you can't taste it at all, and it's a nice thickener for soups as well.
That's great.
Tip number 6, if a recipe calls for whole milk, so that's like the 3.25% milk, you can swap it out with a lower fat milk or use a milk alternative like almond milk or soy milk. I mean, there's so many now different milk alternatives, coconut milk, as they're often lower in fat and calories. So that's always a great way to reduce fat. And the last tip here, tip number 7. This is always a tough one. Ooey gooey cheese. Sometimes I think it's best to just use less of the full fat cheese versus swapping it out to a low fat cheese. But this would depend on the recipe. Sometimes a 50-50 mix is also an option. So my rule of thumb is if you're mixing it into the recipe and you don't really know the difference, then go ahead with the low fat cheese. However, if the physical quality of the cheese is going to be compromised, then go with a 50-50 mix. So for example, I like to make homemade pizza, and the low-fat cheese doesn't melt very nicely, and you can tell
You
that
have
there's
that
a
like
quality difference.
stringy.
It just kind of crusts over.
Mm-hmm.
And for that, it really, you can tell, oh, that's Susan's homemade, dietitian friendly homemade cheese pizza. So what I like to do, just for, this is for pleasure and enjoyment of making pizza, I like to do a 50-50 mix. So I'll take low fat cheese and I'll mix it with just regular mozzarella cheese. And then that way it's reducing and I'm still getting all the qualities that I like of fresh mozzarella. So, however, in something like lasagna, where it melts anyhow, you can absolutely use the low-fat cheese in the recipe because you're not going to notice the difference, and you'll still get the taste, and it will be perfectly fine for you.
Sure. And a lot of times, even in like those mixed dishes, like a lasagna, I'll mix like half low fat ricotta, which is like lower than a hard cheese, or cottage cheese, and I'll mix it with the cheese that it calls for so that, it goes a little bit further. And then you're also getting that added protein that comes with like the ricotta or the cottage cheese. And people, they might say, I hate cottage cheese. But in lasagna, they're not going to know it's there. I promise.
Yeah. Good. Yeah, that's a great tip. One thing to keep in mind is when it comes to low-fat cheese, you don't want to, or you would like to purchase the oldest version of it. So my husband really likes old cheddar, and I find old cheddar in itself very strong. But we buy the low-fat version of it, and the low-fat version of old cheddar is equivalent to about a medium or a mild of regular cheddar. So if you're buying low-fat versions, try to go with strong, sharp cheeses in the old or low-fat versions like Swiss or sharp cheddar, and you'll like the lower fat versions a lot better because they'll have more flavor. That's the one complaint I get from clients is they'll tell me, oh, I've tried low-fat cheese, but it has no taste.
So go with the older.
Yeah. Go with the older. So yeah, that's our 7 tips for fat replacing. It's actually just 7. We have another series on fat replacers in the upcoming episodes. We're just trying to, make sure you got those 7 and start working on them, and we'll give you some more tips coming up. We do have a downloadable guide on all the different recipe makeover tips that you can get in the show notes. But before we finish off, let's talk about, we were talking about going ahead and talking about our recipe makeover wins, or our meal prep wins, and our fails, or, not so great wins. So I have the other one for this week to tell you a little bit about. I think I told you that I've been feeling a little under the weather this week, and I got home and I used my Instapot and made some chicken and wild rice soup. It was really probably my best version I've made in a long time, and it was so good, and it felt really good when I was feeling sick. And when we were done supper, I made extra for the next day for lunch and then also for supper because I knew I wasn't getting any better. So I put it into containers and I put it on the counter to just cool off. And really, you don't want to leave it on the counter for too long, but I was just going to do it for 20 minutes. But I got sidetracked, and then I had some Neocitrin, which made me really tired, and then I went to bed and I completely forgot about all of my leftover soup that I made. And from a food safety standpoint, you can't have it the next day.
That's too long.
Good. Yeah.
Too long. Dangerous.
Definitely dangerous. So I had to throw it all out. So the win was like, I was so smart. I batch cooked. I made extra. But something to keep in mind, don't leave it on the counter. Try to cool it off as fast as you can and get it into the fridge so that you don't get sidetracked and forget about it. So that's my fail. It happens to us all, but hopefully you'll learn from me and put your stuff away right away after you've done any batch cooking.
So that's all for us today. Thank you so much for listening. Please make sure to subscribe to us on iTunes, or if you're watching on YouTube, you can subscribe there too. We actually would love if you could subscribe to us on the YouTube channel right now. We're needing to hit 100 subscribers so that we can ask to get the URL Get Meal Prepped, and it will just make it easier for other people to find us. So if you feel like helping us out, please subscribe and leave us a review on iTunes as well. Don't forget to get your recipe makeover guide that you can download below in the show notes as well. If you're looking for more information on meal planning or to take our online meal planning course called Get Meal Prepped, go to www.getmealprepped.com for more information. And if you want to connect with us, please email us at info@nutritionacademy.co or find us on Instagram at nutrition_academy, or you can also join our Facebook page called Nutrition Academy. That's all for now. Take care. Bye.